We're done. Throughout this course, you learned a lot about Ionic and how to build exciting applications with the many features it offers you. Most importantly, we built a web app, and still we can run this as a native mobile app, and of course we can also deploy it as such an app therefore. And that's exactly what we'll do in this module. I'll first of all start by adding custom icons and a splash screen for our mobile apps so that you can customize that, and I'll show you how that would work. And once we're done with that, we can build the app and you will learn how to deploy it as an Android app, so to the Google Play Store, how to deploy it as an iOS app to the Apple App Store, and how to deploy it as a progressive web app or as a web app in general, because that of course is also something you can do. We tested this app in the browser all the time. Well, obviously we did so because it is a web app and hence we can deploy it as such. And in this module we'll cover all these cases. So we want to deploy our app here as a native app. That is what I'll start with. And for these native apps, I want to have my own icons and my own splash screen. Now, before we actually add these, let's build our app so that we can open it in Android Studio and Xcode and prepare it for deployment. For this, what you can do is you can simply run ng build --prod to build your application for production with the help of the Angular CLI. And for this command to work, you need to make sure you have the Angular CLI installed globally on your machine. Now, this will take your web app and build it as it would build any regular, normal Angular app, which you don't build as an Ionic app or which you don't plan on publishing as a native app. So this is what it'll do now. Let's wait for that to finish. Because with this finished, you can now run Ionic Capacitor sync Android. And what this will do is it will take your built web app and basically copy it into the Android folder. And then you repeat that command for iOS. Important, you can only build for iOS if you are building this on Mac OS. On Windows or Linux, you can only build for Android. Now, this simply takes the built web app and also copies it into the iOS and Android folders so that we can continue there. Side note, you can always go into that capacitor config JSON file and adjust your app ID here, which should then be picked up once you do run Ionic Capacitor run or Ionic Capacitor sync. So this is that unique app identifier which you need to set to deploy your app, because this will uniquely identify your app in the app stores. So definitely make sure you set this. And as I explained earlier in the course, this should be set to an identifier which looks like a reverse domain, which doesn't have to really exist, but which in the end is your unique identifier, which is why here you typically use your company or your personal name. You end with .com or you start with .com therefore, and then you have like a descriptor of your app. And of course, that can be whatever you want. Typically, you'd of course not name it Udemy course Ionic Angular, but something like mycoolcompany.fitness tracker 2019 or whatever your name is. But that's just a side note. I will also show you how to adjust it from inside Xcode or Android Studio. And that's the next step. Let's run Ionic Capacitor open Android to open our project in Android Studio. And then, of course, repeat the same with iOS if you're on a Mac to also open it in Xcode. Now, here's the project in Android Studio, and it should automatically have that Android manifest XML file opened here. You can also open that in Visual Studio Code here in the Android folder under App. And there in the source folder, you should find that Android manifest file, which is that same file. Now, what you'll notice here, for me at least, is that the package ID that is used here is indeed not the one coded or added to this capacitor config file I showed you. Well, maybe this changes in the future, because I think it should. But right now, to adjust your app ID for Android, edit it here in the Android manifest file in that Android folder and set it just as I described it a few seconds ago to that unique identifier formatted like a URL or a reverse URL. Make sure to adjust that here, and you can learn more about that in the capacitor documentation if you scroll down to Android configuration. There you also learn that you should change the app ID here in your Android manifest. You also learn how you can change your app name here. And for that, you go into the resources folder in the Android folder there. And then under values, strings XML, here you find your app name. And I will name this pair BNB because that's what we're building here. And I'll also name my main activity pair BNB because that is what essentially gets shown in that task manager, for example. And I will also update my package name here to match that package name I have provided here in that capacitor config file. So in these three places, I'll set it to my identifier chosen there, and also in the Android manifest. So if I go back up there to the Android manifest, here I also want to use my identifier. And you find most of these steps also described here. The important steps are all mentioned here. Now, with that set up, we should also check our permissions, and there we already had a look earlier in this course. You basically describe what your app is allowed to do. Now, we definitely want internet access. We also want to be able to write to our storage. We want to be able to get that location, network state should be determined, camera. We actually don't really need to record audio or modify the audio settings, so you should be able to remove these two permissions, but in the end you should always check, of course, with what your app uses and thoroughly test it after changing the Android manifest. So with that, we prepared Android. Now to also prepare iOS, let me open this up in Xcode. Here I am, and side note, just as you can configure Android here in your project folder, you can also dive into iOS there in the app folder. And in that app folder, you'll find the info plist, which is a file where you can configure a lot of things, like for example, your display name of the application, which I'll also name pair BNB here. There also are dynamically injected things which you should not override here. Now back in Xcode, here in the open project, you can click on your project here on the left. There you can also edit the things I just showed you in the configuration, like for example that display name. Here it also did pick up that identifier specified in the capacitor config, so no need to change it here. And before you deploy, you should also set your versions here to a version that is seen from outside, that version, which you should of course change whenever you update your app, and an internal build, which you definitely should change. It's not visible to the outside, but it internally and in the App Store controls which version is the most recent version and so on. For Android, to go back to that, we have something similar. If you go into that Android folder, there in the app folder, we have that build Gradle file where you also set a version name that is visible to the outside world, which you can set to whatever you want, and your internal version, which you should also always change whenever you're deploying a new app version. And here we have another case where we definitely should add our application ID. So with that, Android is prepared. iOS is prepared, and if you want to configure more here, definitely dive into the official documentation for publishing Android and iOS apps. I also wanted to show you how to generate these icons, right? So now with the app generally prepared, let's do this next. To add icons, we can use tools, and I'll use Image Gorilla. You can just Google for that and you should find it on apetools.webprofusion.com. And this is a convenient tool which allows you to specify one PNG file in this format and one splash screen PNG file in this format to automatically generate the resources you need for your application. And I will use that to generate my iOS resources. For Android, we can use a tool built into Android Studio, because it turns out in your iOS app, if you have a look at that XC assets folder here in your project, that you have to provide all these icons for your app to support different devices and screen sizes. Manually creating all these files is a lot of work, and that's what a tool like this does for us. So here, let's choose a file. And attached, you find an example icon you can use here. Of course, for your app, you should use your own icon. So let's use that as an icon here. Let's use the splash screen as a, well, splash screen. And then select iOS down there. You don't need to select anything else. And select iOS, not iOS Ionic. iOS is fine. And click Kapow. And this will now generate these assets for you. And once it's done, it'll give you a download. Here we are. Download that zip file. And in that downloaded and extracted zip file, you'll find that iOS folder with your app icons and your launch screen images. You don't actually need all these files, but now here in Xcode, you can just open that assets folder here, go to app icon, and now drag and drop the icons into the places where they belong. So here we have 20 point and then 2x, 3x. Well, that's also what we have here. So let's drag 2x in there and 3x in there. We have 29 points, 2x and 3x. So let's drag this in here and this in here. We have 40 point, 2x and 3x. So let's drag 2x in here and 3x in here. We have 60 points, 2x and 3x. So same game, of course. Let's drag these files in here. We have 20 points, 1 and 2x. So let's drag these files in here. We have 29 points, 1x and 2x. So make sure to also drag these files in here. 40 points, 1x and 2x. Now I have no 40 point 1x. So what I did here is I quickly generated this off screen in Photoshop. It's simply a 40 by 30 image, half the size of the 2x. So I took the 2x one and basically just halved its dimensions. You find that attached to this video here so that you can continue. But if you're missing it for your project, simply generate it in your own image editing tool. Now for 76 pixels, we need 1x and 2x. And I do have them here. So let's drag and drop them in here. We have 83.5 pixels, 2x. We do have that here as well. Whoops. So let's drag that in. However, for me, it didn't like that generated one. So I created a fixed size by halving the one that I had here, which was too big. Again, you find that fixed one attached to this video. And if you're getting an error for any of these icons, just manually adjust them. Now last but not least, that marketing icon, we can drag it in here. So now all these icons are replaced. For the splash screen here, let's have a look at that launch image folder. And there we have so many icons. Now I will simply use one and the same launch image here. So I'll drag the same PNG into all these fields, use the same image for all device sizes. You can, of course, go into more detail here and manually adjust this for all kinds of devices. With that, iOS is prepared. Now, what about Android? There, conveniently, we have a built-in tool to generate these assets. For that, you can click on App here, right-click on Resources, and add a new image asset. And here, you can now choose what you want to generate. Now, I want to generate launcher icons, adaptive and legacy. And here, you can leave the name as it is, but you want to replace that path here to the image. And there, choose your icon PNG file and open that. And now it basically generates all these icons for you. And if you're not happy with what it generated here, you can, of course, for example, trim them here. Let's pick a background color that is white. And then maybe go with that. And of course, again, feel free to play around with that and adjust it to your needs. You can then click Next, and this will now basically replace the existing icon or icons with that new one, so that you automatically have a project that uses, well, a new set of icons. Your own one, to be precise. Now, for the splash screen, we still need a tool, and there I will go back to Image Gorilla. And of course, we could have done that right at the start, but now I will also check Android here and try again with that selection. And now here, I just will restart Image Gorilla, add my splash screen, check Android and Kapow, and just generates the Android splash screens. And once you downloaded that and extracted it, you'll have an Android folder here in your extracted bundle. And in that drawable folders here, you have icons too, which you can ignore, but you also have that screen PNG file. And now, of course, in our project here, we can replace our splash screen here, splash PNG, with these new screen files. And I'll quickly do that in Visual Studio Code here by going to Source, Res, and then here we have these drawable folders, and organized a bit differently as they are really stored on our device. And there I want to replace these splash PNG files here. So with that, make sure you rename these generated files to splash PNG, and then drag them from the folder in which they are, for example, from drawable land HDPI folder in the extracted generated splash screen project, drag them into this folder here and replace the existing splash screen, of course, and that gives you your splash screen. And now I'll do this for all these drawable folders here where I have a splash PNG file. Now in the port folders, you can just use your normal drawable HDPI folder assets you find in that bundle. So basically these assets here, for example. And with all of them replaced here, let's try running our app again. So here on Android, I'll run the app and bring it up on an emulator. And there we should now see that icon and new splash screen, of course. So that would be the hope that this is the case. Let's run it on Android first, and thereafter also try it on iOS, of course. Now let's start that application. And here's our splash screen. And here's our application. Now that's Android. Let's now give iOS a try. And for that, let's run this on an iPhone simulator. Click that play button here, and let's see if that works. Here's our device starting up. And that looks good. We see the splash screen here. And if I close that, here's also our icon. With all the icons and splash screens added, let's deploy the applications. And let's start with Android. For that, visit your Android Studio project, and there under Build, you can generate a signed bundle or APK, which is what we need to do here. Now leave the default Android app bundle checked and click Next. And now you need a key store where you can create a new one. Choose a path for that key store, first of all, and that can simply be your project path, which is what I'll choose here. So I'll add my key store here in my project path. Assign a password, one that you should, of course, remember. You can leave the alias here as it is and assign another password here. Leave the validity, then enter some data about yourself. This is all data that is basically used for signing the app, and signing is a process that basically makes sure that you are the owner of the app, you are the creator, and you are the only one to change that app or to manage that app. The exact data you fill in here, of course, doesn't matter, but it should be truthy because that is what you kind of use for signing and what you kind of leave as a footprint here. And with all that, you got a new key store. You can leave everything as it is here, and then choose a build type, which should be release, and finish this. And what this will now do is it will take your application and put it into an APK, so into a bundle which you can upload to the Play Store, and sign it with your data to add some proof that you are the creator of this application and to kind of link it to you, you could say. So let's wait for this build to finish. And once this is done, you can upload this For that, you can search for Google Play Store console to find that management area for you as a developer. There, you need to sign in with your Google account, and then you need to accept the developer agreement and pay a one-time registration fee, which isn't too high. It's no subscription. It's just one time. This is basically there to make sure that only people that have at least some serious intentions release apps to the App Store. Now here I am logged in after accepting the agreement and paying that fee. And here you can now click Create Application. Choose your default language, give it a name like Firebase or whatever the name of your application, of course, is. Click Create here. And then here you need to fill out information about that application, upload some images, and basically build that page your app will have in the App Store. And of course, therefore, you definitely want to add information here that makes people want to download it. Now, what you of course need to do also is under App Releases here, you can upload a new app release. For that, go to Production Track and click Manage, create a release. Continue here. And now browse files and upload your APK. Now, where do you find that? It's in your project folder under Android, App, Release, and that is your app bundle. And now this gets uploaded here, is processed, and thereafter, once you also finish the rest here, you can publish this app bundle. And that is how you deploy your app to Android. We saw how we can deploy to Android. Now, what about iOS? Well, first of all, in your Xcode project, you should make sure you have a provisioning profile here chosen. And now you also need an Apple developer account where you pay for it. So you need a paid Apple developer account because only paying Apple developers can publish apps to the App Store. That is how it is. So make sure to log into your Apple developer account and get such a paid account if you don't have one yet. And once you have this and you're logged in, you can start setting everything up to deploy your app. For that, first of all, go to Certificates, IDs, and Profiles. And there, go to App IDs and add a new app ID. Now, give it any description you want, like Airbnb. And assign an explicit app ID here, which should simply be that app ID you're using here as a bundle identifier as well. So let's add that here. Check any extra services you might be using. We are not using any of these services, and click Continue and Register. Now, with that app ID registered, we completed the first step. The next step is that we create the app itself here on this Apple backend, you could say. For that, you need to go to the App Store Connect section in your Apple developer account. Go to App Store Connect. And here on the top, click on Users and Access and go to My Apps. There, on the My Apps page, click on that plus here to create a new app. And there again, select your name, which is then also the name being used everywhere. Choose your platform, which should be iOS. Your primary language, which for me is English. Choose your identifier. And it can take a few seconds before you see the one you just created here. So check back later. If it's not there, you're here for the first time, as it was for me. So now I added everything here and selected my identifier here. You can give this your own identifier that shows up on your payment statements and so on. So you can add whatever you want here. And then click Create once you're happy. This creates your own app here on App Store Connect. And just as on the Google Play console, here you can fill out everything that will be seen in the Apple App Store. So make sure to thoroughly fill this out. Now let's go back to Xcode because it's here where we will deploy this app. And here, stop your currently running app on the emulator. Then also choose generic iOS device as a target here in this dropdown. And then go to Product Archive here. This will now bundle your app for deployment to the Apple App Store. Once this finishes, this Xcode organizer here should open up. And there you see your archives. Now I created 2 here. You probably only see 1. And then you can click Distribute App to upload that to the App Store and then finally release it there from inside AppTunes Connect. This is how you deploy your iOS app. So this is how we deploy our apps to the app stores, which of course is one of the main reasons why you often use Ionic and Capacitor. But you're not limited to that. All the time we were testing a web app in the browser, so why don't we deploy it as such? And actually, we already got one. Since we ran ng-build prod earlier in this module, we have this www folder which holds a web app that can be used just like that is ready to be deployed to a web server. And actually, let me show this to you by using Firebase. However, I don't just want to publish a regular web app, I want to publish a progressive web app. Now, what turns a web app into a progressive web app? It still is a web app, it just uses a service worker which can cache certain assets on the front end to serve your app faster on subsequent requests, and in general, make your app feel a bit more native-like whilst running in the browser. You can take my complete progressive web app course if you want to learn all about that exciting technology. Turning an Angular app in a progressive web app is straightforward. You just run ng-add @angular/pwa for progressive web app. And this will now configure this Angular project such that it automatically generates such a service worker that is responsible for that caching and so on, and basically sets up everything you need to have a progressive web app. Nothing else needed. Once all of that is done, you'll have a ngswconfig JSON file, which allows you to configure that service worker. Now, more information about that can be found on the official Angular docs under Techniques, Service Workers, and PWA. There you'll learn more about what you can configure there and how it works. This generally sets up which of your assets will be cached in which way, and that caching again will happen in the browser once users have visited your page to make subsequent visits faster and potentially even provide offline support. Now, with all of that added, you don't need to change anything. The defaults are pretty good. And you can run ng-build --prod again to now build the Angular app again, taking this new configuration into account. Side note, of course, you can also set a fav icon, for example, here by adding icons into your assets folder. You get the Angular icon out of the box. You can replace that fav icon, which is the Ionic icon, and these Android icons here with your own icons that should have these sizes that are encoded here in the file names if you want to have your own icons for your web app as well. I will not do it here since it's not really a difficult task, just a time-consuming one. Instead, let's wait for this build to finish and let me then show you how you could deploy this to Firebase, though of course you can deploy it to any static host like AWS S3 or whatever your favorite static website host is. The static host thing is important though, since it's a front-end driven web app with HTML, front-end JavaScript and CSS only. You need no PHP or Node.js server on the backend. You really need only a host that is capable of serving HTML, JavaScript and CSS, like Firebase hosting or AWS S3. So building the project finished. Now I wanna, as I mentioned before, deploy this to Firebase, but just as an example, you're not limited to Firebase. Since we already added Firebase Cloud Functions though, adding hosting is particularly easy. You simply run Firebase init again in your project. And we already added functions in the past. Now we also add hosting here. So simply check hosting and hit tab. Now, what do you want as your public directory? Here we'll use www because that is the folder that holds our built assets. We want to configure this as a single page app, yes, because that's what it is. So enter a Y here. I don't want to overwrite my index.html file. Instead, I want to use the one I had. And with that, we got this Firebase JSON file with some configuration about the hosting, which you should leave as it is. The default should work here. we can now run Firebase deploy here, and this will now deploy our cloud function as it did before, but it will also now deploy our web app to Firebase hosting. So let's wait for that to finish. And once this is done, you see the URL where your app will be hosted at here. Of course, you can also connect your own domains here if you want to stick to Firebase hosting. The official docs tell you more. If I enter that domain here into the browser though, I see my web app here. And obviously feel free to adjust the styling to whatever you want. But this is now our web app as we built it throughout this course and as it also runs as a native app. But now here in the browser. And it works just as it does on the mobile devices. This is the app we built where we can book our events and so on. So that is our web app we built. And you also learned how to deploy this app as a native app. Therefore, I hope you now have all the tools you need to build amazing apps, use amazing features, and then, of course, deploy them to any platform you want to deploy them to.